Now, as we talk about auditing standards, we're going to kind of hit all of these different standards that are defined by the ISACA. The first is the audit charter. Okay, that's your contract. This is the purpose, responsibility, authority, and accountability of the IS function. In other words, the contract, the charter is saying, why are you doing the audit? Who's responsible? Who has the authority and accountability of this function? Right? We're going to outline all of the basic roles of not only those who are doing the audit, but what's expected of those who are being audited. Independence. That includes professional independence in all matters related to the audit. And organizational independence in that the audit function should be independent of what's being audited. Again, I use the example that, if I was an internal employee and I'm doing an audit of a bank, but the bank manager over me knows that something I found could be very embarrassing to him or her, that might be undue influence that they could cause me, like little subtle hints about my job and remaining employed. I should be able to do an audit being independent of those things being audited. Another good reason to have a contract. Because regardless of whether they like the information or not, as long as I'm professional, I'm accurate, and I'm competent, the goal is to make them better. And sometimes you have that political pressure. Well, when I'm contracted, I'm going to get paid either way, hopefully. That kind of helps me in my independence as well, because I know that I'm there to do a job. Anyway, that's all it's trying to say is that we should not have that undue pressure. Professional ethics and standards. The auditor should adhere to the ISACA's Code of Professional Ethics that I've just talked about. Some of the other standards are things like professional competence. Now, I know we've already hit a lot of these, and you're thinking, man, you've already talked about these. Yes, we have. But we're putting them into the perspective of the standards, guidelines, and procedures and where they fall. And professional competence is another standard. The auditor should maintain their skills and knowledge to be able to professionally conduct the audit assignments. In other words, if I have somebody who's really good with Windows operating systems and knows nothing about Cisco routing and switching, I'm not going to put them into that audit position of something they don't know. I want to use their skills and knowledge professionally and make sure that they have the skills and knowledge updated for the areas that they are assigned. Another standard is planning. The auditor should plan the manner in which the audit will be performed to be able to make sure you cover all of the audit objectives as well as any applicable laws. And those plans should document in detail the nature and objectives of the audits as well as the timing, right? When it's going to happen and what resources are required to make this happen. Another standard covers the performance of audit work. Now, this can be divided into three areas. The first is supervision. That's where the audit staff should be supervised to make sure that they are finding and getting to the objectives and that they are accomplishing the objectives of the audit. That's, first line management. Next is evidence. This talks about where the auditor should be able to provide reliable and relevant evidence to document their findings. And it reminds me of a story of a person I was talking to who was a part of an audit team for a bank. And during their process of auditing, they found that a person who was able to log in at the level of a mail clerk had the ability, if they knew how to do it, to be able to go out and write letters of credit. And as a part of his evidence, he did that. He logged on with that clerk, wrote the letter of credit for $2 million, and printed it out, and that was part of the evidence. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go to that extreme, because, I kind of question, that whole process, because I'm thinking, the financial part of this now suddenly has a $2 million letter of credit they got to account for, and so it wouldn't be something I would have done. Maybe a screenshot of, being at that location, that screen, and able to do it. Anyway, that's examples of evidence anyway. And we use that to help document the findings. Now, the documentation merely suggests that the audit process should be recorded, listing the work and the evidence to be able to support findings and conclusions. And by the way, that's a very important process, because it's one thing, and I know this happens in the industry. I haven't seen it happen. Well, maybe to some extent. I'm thinking of another bank. They contacted me to learn more about the auditing process because they had hired a firm who charged them a flat fee plus a certain fee per IP address of what was being audited. It turned out to be a very large amount of money. And all they did was run a little program called Nessus that did some automatic checks against all these different systems on the network, and then just printed these default things out, and that was their findings and conclusions. In a way, it did support the work that was done, as opposed to they could have just said, oh, I checked and everything's fine. That makes me think, did you do the work? How do I know you did the work if you can't show me any evidence, right? Support to be able to show your findings and conclusions. So it's important that we have it. It's a part of the evidence. And we'll get to talk a little bit more about evidence as we go on. Now, one of the standards for reporting describes the appropriate forms that should be completed at the end of the audit. This report usually will restate the scope, the objectives, the time that the audit occurred, and what work was performed. Now, the reports should state the findings, the conclusions, and recommendations of the audit team, and they should also contain the evidence needed to support results. And guess what? We're talking about these as overviews, and we'll have the chance to talk in more detail about reports as well. Some of the other standards, of course, would be your follow-up activities. That would be the reporting of recommendations to the organization for the purpose of bringing them into compliance. Sometimes we might even call that remediation. Basically, we're saying, this is what we found that's not in compliance. Here's our recommendations of what you can do. And the reason that's important is because we're leaving it up to the management to choose which of the recommendations they want to follow. Anyway, again, part of reporting, we're going to get a chance to talk more about that. Standards about the irregularities and illegal acts, which should be a part of the reporting and part of the finished body of work. Now, what does that mean? That means that we might have located perhaps areas of fraud through the use of our auditing, or things that people are doing illegally. And we need to report those things. Even if you might say, that's going to cause Fred over here a lot of angst. They might even get to go to jail because of what I found. That's, and I hate to sound callous, but that's your job. If you find those irregularities or illegal acts, you need to make sure that's a part of the report. Regardless of how you feel about the person that might affect, it is not your job to be the judge and the jury, just to report what you found. Let somebody else, if they need to, get further into that investigation. And I know I'm going off on all these ideas that we're going to get to talk about, in a little bit more detail as we go on. Anyway, so the standards. So now what that means is, how do we look at these? Well, as an auditor, we should always be skeptical during the audit, knowing that there are going to be some irregularities or even illegal acts, that they could exist, and there may even be attempts by people to hide those acts from you while you're doing the audit. If those acts are found, you should make sure you have the sufficient evidence to be able to support your finding. But then again, that's true of any of the facts that you bring into your report. You should have evidence to support that. Now, IT governance is a process where the auditor can assess if the IS function is in alignment with the organization's mission, its vision, its values, objectives, and strategies. Now, the auditor should determine whether the IS function is a clear statement about the performance expectations. Part of governance is that the review and assessment of how effective the resources and performance management processes are running. We should be looking, the audit should be looking and reviewing, able to assess the compliance with legal, environmental, and information quality, as well as any fiduciary and security requirements. The audit should be done in a risk-based approach, and we'll talk about what that means, risk-based, later on, but it should be done in that approach, which can include those risks that could adversely affect the IS environment. Now, you might notice as I every now and then keep saying, we'll talk more about. Again, we're laying the foundation here about what these standards are. And we, as a standard, we may mention something that we certainly are going to get into more detail about later. I just want to make sure you understand that we will talk about that. So when you hear me say risk-based approach, and you say, well, what is the risk-based approach? I don't understand how the standard works if I don't know what this is. We're building the foundation of what the standard is, and we're going to, kind of help continue to build on it as we go through. Part of the standards, again, is that the use of risk assessment and audit planning involves the appropriate assessment techniques or approach that's used in developing the audit plan. Now, the process should determine the priorities for the effective allocation of your IS audit resources. Now, remember, Those resources are often the people doing the audit. The audit materiality should be considered with the relationship to the audit risk. This is useful for determining the nature and timing that you're going to use for the audit. It also can help you determine the extent of the audit procedures. When planning for the audit, the auditor should consider potential weaknesses or absence of controls, and if these could result in efficiency or material weaknesses in the information systems. Again, part of the materiality, some of the weaknesses could be considered minor control deficiencies that the auditor should consider the overall effect of these deficiencies could have in the information systems. Now, let me think of it, try to word that in a little different way, because I'm giving you the standard. The idea is, you might say, oh, I found a deficiency, but it's pretty minor. And you might say, in fact, so minor, maybe not worthy of an extra footnote. But if I find 10, 15, 20 minor deficiencies, as a whole, could they really open up a major problem for this particular organization? The answer is probably that they could. So even though you find a minor deficiency, we need to know how that's going to be looked at as a whole with all of those minor deficiencies. It's, it just goes back to the fact that your strength of your systems, is as good as your weakest link many times. So just make sure you have that whole picture as you're doing this audit. And of course, these deficiencies, even if they're minor, they should be included in the report. You might be using the work of other experts, and if it's been done, you should consider that information where appropriate for your audit. Now, the outside work should be assessed and determined if it meets special qualifications and competencies. Again, just because somebody hands me a report and says this is what these other folks did, I still want to know, did the people that created the report have what it takes to be able to do the audit? In any event, the outside work should be a part of the review and evaluation process. The audit process should determine if the outside work is adequate and complete, and the results of that review that you make of that outside work should also be clearly documented. Now, your audit evidence, as I mentioned before, should be sufficient and appropriate to support the audit conclusions. Your IT controls should be evaluated and monitored, especially if they're an integral part of the internal control environment of this organization. Now, the auditor can help assist management by giving some advice to the regards of the design or the use of the controls. And that's kind of our idea, right? That's a part of our recommendations. We should be able to say, here's things you could do to improve the controls, or maybe other ways in which you could use it, or even make recommendations for new ones. E-commerce should be evaluated along with any applicable controls. Risk assessment should be used when you're reviewing the e-commerce environment to make sure that those transactions are properly controlled. Now, that's an important aspect, right? Because e-commerce, we're talking about money being exchanged, especially from other customers, other people that it could affect. And so again, that risk assessment type of approach should be done not only throughout most of the audit, but especially in the e-commerce environment.